The presidential transition in 2025 triggered an abrupt reversal across federal policymaking, with agencies shifting from one set of priorities to another almost instantaneously. That whiplash was intensified by a surge of midnight rules on the way out and rapid reversals on the way in, as well as a renewed push by President Trump to expand executive authority. We'll walk through how that turbulence is reshaping regulation with Finn Dobkin and Matias Vesperoni of the George Washington University Regulatory Studies Center. Finn and Matias, it's great to have you on the show this morning.
Happy to be here.
Finn, let me begin with you. Last year's regulatory story was really dominated by the presidential transition, and that kind of led to a pivot in policymaking. We've seen a lot of executive orders and maybe less in the rulemaking space. Kind of lay out how that transition shaped the regulatory landscape for us.
Yeah, so obviously there's a lot going on last year. I think the main theme that you pointed out here was that there's a lot of actions by executive order. And I think a lot of attempts to centralize rulemaking into OIRA and the executive office of the president, perhaps more than we typically saw. I think a few good examples of that are now, for example, independent agencies are required to submit certain rules for OIRA review. That wasn't a thing in the past. We saw independent agencies. We saw firings of certain members of independent agencies. That wasn't a huge theme before. And so I think that there's overall this general theme of moving towards centralizing a lot of those regulatory powers within the presidency. And so I think that's really going to be something to look out for in the upcoming year and the remainder of the administration, but also just a good way to reflect on the past year in regulation.
It's a really helpful framing. Matias, the team that did the review pointed out that, as a reminder, outgoing administrations try to entrench last-minute rules and incoming administrations try to undo them as quickly as possible. What stood out to you about how that back and forth played out in 2025?
Yeah, so it's been a big trend to kind of lean on deregulation in general, and that's kind of speaking towards what you were saying about trying to get rid of what the previous administration had kind of imposed during their time there. And this was kind of really seen by changing a little bit the OIRA procedures, and again through executive action, as Finn had mentioned. And this was kind of seen through, making OIRA go and check on independent agencies' rulemaking and also make it easier for them to review deregulation by making the time spent on deregulation minimal and making it go from 120 days to like 28 days. So we see that what they really tried to aim for is to make the deregulation process as smooth and quick as possible.
Finn.
Yeah, I think one important thing to add there is that it wasn't just the presidency that was trying to get rid of Biden-era regulations. It was also Congress. And so because Republicans controlled both chambers and the presidency, they're able to effectively use the Congressional Review Act to rescind Biden-era regulations. And so we've seen that used quite extensively during the 119th Congress and are even seeing it being used in some novel ways with, for example, land management plans, which weren't historically something that the CRA was used for. Those are informal adjudications. They're typically less politically salient than say a major or significant rule. And so I think this is another novel use of trying to cut back the previous administration's rules.
The Congressional Review Act typically is something that's way in the background, and it has received quite a bit more attention this year. I think this is really an important theme, and I think it's really goes to some major questions around thinking about how rules are impacting industry, either through the framework of regulatory uncertainty or through regulatory burden. Because I think one of the things with this is that when you have this sort of back and forth administration to administration or Congress to Congress, you tend to have a lot more uncertainty built up in the regulatory space. And I think that is, a theme that's worth noting during this past year is that you have a lot more going on in terms of just the volume of change has been quite significant. And I think there's been different responses to that across stakeholder groups. Matias, I want to come back to you on the deregulation comment, because this administration had a rule, wasn't it? One regulation out, but you had to terminate 10 others before you could get a new one?
Yeah, so this was kind of an extension of what Trump had done in his first term, where he had the 2-to-1 rule, where you had to eliminate 2 rules to be able to propose a new one. And he basically escalated this by creating the 10-to-1, which is the same concept, except you now have to eliminate 10 rules to be able to impose a new one. And this is a big trend throughout the year because we've seen a lot of just rescinding rules and getting rid of old rules just to make space for new ones.
Are they holding to that 10-to-1 ratio?
It seems to be pretty well held, yes. People are deregulating quite a bit just to be able to keep up.
I'm speaking with Matias Vesperoni and Finn Dobkin. Matias is a policy analyst. Finn is a senior policy analyst, both at George Washington University's Regulatory Studies Center. Finn, let me come back to you. This review notes that in President Trump's second term, he's leaned heavily into a much more expansive approach to executive authority. How do you see that playing out in the regulatory space?
Yeah, like I said, there are some of these major themes around independent agency review. That's not typically, those have been fairly politically insulated in the past. And I think that's going to be a big theme in the coming year. Aside from the firings that we've seen at Merit Protections Board, at FCC, we're seeing some of these themes challenged in court directly. The independent agency, independent status has been justified under Humphrey's executor. That's a 1935 case. That was before the Supreme Court. We're now seeing that challenged in Slaughter v. Trump, which is going to directly address that question, unlike some of the previous firings, which were sort of stopped at the district or appellate level. So I think that's a big one. Matias highlighted a few of them with centralizing OIRA review with the 10-for-1 order. I think other than that, a big one is Jeffrey Clark, the associate administrator for OIRA. He issued a memo that set specific timelines for how quickly certain rules have to be reviewed by OIRA. That's going to not necessarily centralize review further, but it will definitely increase if it is successfully implemented, will increase the volume of rules that could potentially be reviewed by OIRA, or at the very least, increase the volume of rules reviewed by OIRA.
Matias?
Yeah, and so a little bit adding to that, the Clark memo kind of gave a precedent for this administration kind of leaning on legal kind of exceptions to be used, mostly kind of like the good cause exception in the APA and other things, as well as the Loper Bright case. So we've seen a lot of these like legal exceptions also being used to kind of go through the deregulatory process as well.
Let's follow on with that. Finn, let me come back to you on these legal cases. How do you expect those legal battles to shape the terrain for 2026?
Yeah, so I think some of the big things that are going to be salient here are some decisions from last year or from the year prior. For example, Loper Bright, which ended Chevron deference, has been moving down through the lower courts. And that basically actually is going to restrict what the federal government and agencies can and cannot do, because courts are no longer supposed to defer to a reasonable interpretation of a statute. And so that's going to have a major effect on what can be done by the agencies in that regard. And so I think that's going to be the main thing to look out for. I think SEC versus Jarkissi is another case that's sort of flowing down through the courts, and that relates to how administrative courts within agencies can pursue penalties. And so that's going to really restrict the EOP and executive branch agencies in a way that I think is in some ways running counter to what they're trying to do by centralizing powers.
Matias, I want to change direction just a little bit and come back to you. The report highlights changes across 9 domains: climate change to energy to labor and immigration and others. Which of those domains do you think saw the most significant break from prior policy?
I think the ones that saw some significant break from prior policy are definitely, for example, the immigration, which kind of took a different stance, kind of leaning on national security as a main issue rather than the humanitarian approach that the prior administration had kind of taken with immigration regulation. And I think permitting also went through a lot of changes as well, and I think Finn can most likely talk a lot more on that section, and as well as a lot of deregulation in the financial sector, a lot of banking and market deregulation.
Those are all both headline topics and really consequential to how a lot of processes operate in the country. What do you expect to see as a result?
Well, as we have already kind of mentioned and reiterated, a lot of this is passed through executive action, so it's kind of hard to see how much of these changes will actually have an impact in the long term, if they'll last or if they'll hold. So we'll see, but I do suspect that the deregulatory trend will continue.
There's an interesting stat in the report. It says agencies issued more than 2,400 regulations last year, while Congress passed only 68 laws. What does that tell you about the role of the administrative state in keeping all of our government operations flowing?
Yeah, so again, as kind of Finn had mentioned, this kind of speaks towards the centralization of the power to regulate, and it kind of shows the trend of kind of keeping Congress out of the process as much as possible.
And Finn, what should folks be looking for as they're thinking towards their 2026 regulatory agendas?
The thing I've really been paying attention to is that there was so much done through executive orders this past year, and a lot of that is directing agencies to write rules, to propose rules, that sort of thing. And we're not going to necessarily see the results of that overnight. I mean, we had earlier in the year 4 executive orders on streamlining nuclear power come out. And only this past week did we see, to the best of my knowledge, the first rule come out of that. That was a categorical exclusion for advanced nuclear reactors. And so I think the thing to watch out for this year is just what comes out of this huge volume of executive orders that were directing agencies to promulgate rules. I think other than that, keep watching for what Congress is doing in this regard. There's been, I think, a renewed interest in revisiting some of these things like environmental permitting, like AI, things that didn't have a ton of attention either in general in terms of how things were being regulated, or things like permitting that weren't necessarily very salient over the past 30, 40 years, but only in the past few years have they really gotten Congress's attention. And so I think it kind of shows that there might be renewed interest by Congress in terms of regulation.
I've been speaking with Matias Vesperoni and Finn Dobkin, both from the George Washington University Regulatory Studies Center. Thank you both for joining me.
Thank you for having us.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts.